All right, if you're open to 2 Kings 17, we're going to start there in a moment. I want to talk about these handouts first, though. When I was walking out, I noticed Nikki had left her open Bible open in the pew, and I noticed that's the Sennacherib Prism. She's got an open Bible that has a page that has the Sennacherib Prism. It's a common artifact that you see in a lot of places. So let me talk about, first of all, this list that has, it's something that I started on, it's been revised, and it still has needs to be revised again. But I made a proposal early on when we had a new director, Jack Green, who came in from the Ashmolean at Oxford, and said, would you do a prospectus for a biblical tour? It's been revised a number of times. At one point, it was actually on an old Walkman or some derivative of that you could walk around the museum. But the sequence of the galleries is organized through Mesopotamia and ultimately then on the backside to the Megiddo Gallery through Anatolia, and then the Egyptian Gallery and the Persian Gallery and the Nubian Gallery, all of these places that had different sites where he was excavating. And so I gave you a background list after talking a little bit about Kiera and Braidwood and these guys, Breasted, that put the Institute on the map and founded it. But you get artifacts that deal with the development of writing, and then all of the Hittite kingdom, the Megiddo Gallery that we've talked about, the Baal statue we have looked at. We're talking about Shalmaneser right now in Khorsabad, Darsha Rukun Fortress, Sargon, literally. The Sennacherib Prisms, number 15 on this list. These are all big kind of ticket items. The Dead Sea Scrolls I want to talk about tomorrow. We have a Dead Sea Scroll jar. Did I mention pottery? And the only fragment of a Dead Sea Scroll on this side of the pond. You have to go to the British, or actually to the Israel museums where most of them are. And then the ossuaries, of which the ISAC has one. And I want to talk about that when we talk about Jesus tomorrow, because as I said last night, we have an ossuary that has the inscription of Caiaphas, the high priest, who presided at the trial of Jesus. And I made the point, so we have the bones, or at least the ossuary, of Caiaphas, the high priest, but where are the bones of Jesus of Nazareth? We'll talk more about that tomorrow. But if you look at the bottom of this, I want to make this point again, that in addition to these extraordinary museum quality pieces, of which there are at least 20 on my list, there is a lot more. But I try to hit at least these 20 when I'm doing an hour and a half tour. In addition to these extraordinary exhibits, the Institute has thousands of more ordinary artifacts which have no direct bearing on biblical events or texts. So they might be considered by some people as less important. I don't think so. Some people would even say they're insignificant or irrelevant. If they don't talk directly about the Bible, I have no interest in it, some people might say. But these often seemingly mundane objects can inform us about the everyday activities like housing and construction and furniture and food and agricultural practices and cooking and hygiene and so forth and so on, medical practices, jewelry, cosmetics, travel, including water and overland travel, leisure activities, births, deaths, aging, burials, mourning, all of the common activities of human life, which are all mentioned in the Bible. These artifacts give us some insight and some context, to use our word from last night, that help us get to the deep background of what the Bible is saying, and reinforce the fact that at a very minimum, when you're reading the Bible, you are reading a document that's historically accurate in places where it can be tested. Now, there are a few times when people say, well, this detail doesn't match what's in the Bible, and that's correct. There are some challenges that are presented by archaeology, but it's a dynamic, ongoing science. You never know what's going to come out of the ground tomorrow. So are there questions that I can't answer about why at there were no biblical artifacts found in the strata that should have that sort of thing? I don't have a good answer for that, except maybe Dr. Calloway didn't like it when I said this, but maybe that's not really Maybe he sent a gazillion dollars of your tax money digging in the ground in a place that's not really what he thought it was. Now, probably it's don't get me wrong, but there are some questions that we can't answer yet, maybe. So the idea is, in addition to all of these, as you move through the galleries, as we talk about some of them, it may prove useful to take note of these objects and consider how they inform biblical narratives, if you will. Now, the other sheet is as much as I could get on one piece of paper. I think there are about 40 different works here. It omits much. Some of you will look at this and say, well, something else ought to be on here. Yeah, that's right. And I starred with a single star. A double star means start here. And so if you wanted to start, for example, Eric Klein, who is not a biblical-oriented but has some respect for the Bible, has a little short introduction to biblical archaeology. That would be a place to start. Or Fant and Reddish down the list, Lost Treasures of the Bible. That's a whole book on where in the museums of the world are all these artifacts. Where are they? Not where did they come? Well, they'll tell you where they came from. But if you want to know what's in the Louvre, or what's in the British Museum, or the Istanbul Museum, or the Israel Museum, or the ISAC Museum in Chicago, or other places, that's a place to start. I happen to think that David Graves, who's done a number of books, now those are introductory in the sense he's a Bible believer, and his agenda is to line up things from archaeology that correspond to what the Bible says. So I would say start there. There are some other things here that I wouldn't recommend necessarily that you start with. Bart Ehrman, for example, some of you know, teaches at University of North Carolina and is a skeptic, started out as a fundamentalist from the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, went to Princeton, and then has written a raft of books, in some ways challenging the existence of God, dealing with the question of theodicy, or how does God allow evil to exist. And I know I'm treading into Doy's wheelhouse here, but he's done this book called Did Jesus Exist? I'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. Even somebody like Ehrman will say nobody who knows what they're talking about, nobody who has studied the question, with very few exceptions, doubts that Jesus existed. So if you're hearing from some village atheist or somebody who really doesn't know what they're talking about, well, Jesus never existed. Even somebody like Bart Ehrman acknowledges that there's overwhelming evidence, historically speaking, for the existence of Jesus. Now, he doesn't accept him as the Savior of the world or the Son of God or any of his theological things, but that's the point. Novacek is the book that's up here that shows pictorial record of what we have here. Randall Price is another, I think, pretty conservative approach to biblical archaeology. I double-starred Peter Williams, which I think is, again, another place to go maybe after Klein. Can We Trust the Gospels? Which uses a lot of very detailed evidence of what are the place names and the personal names and the location names that we find in the Bible, and how does that line up with what we know from secular history. So I would recommend Peter Williams. Ed Yamauchi, The Stones and the Scriptures, that's the oldest book on here. Most of them are 21st century works, so I tried to be fairly recent with them. But there are a number of things that you might, if you want to go down all of these rabbit trails, here are some places to start, or some things that you might want to explore. I put the Hallow Context of Scripture, the massive 3-volume work, which will set you back several $100s if you want to get the print copy. And I'm not recommending that you should do that. I'm just saying here, just this list alone gives you some idea of how extensive the records are and the amount of material that's been written about all of these biblical artifacts and so forth. But let's start, let's go ahead and start with the biblical text here. Let's go back to 2 Kings 17 here. And Brother Bowers pointed out to me that I had 1 Kings on a previous slide, which leave it to an engineer to find a mistake. I have a guy at Downers Grove who is an accountant, and he finds all my errors, even after I've proofread them, and you never see them until they're on the screen or until they're in print and so forth. But anyway, we're in 2 Kings chapter 17. The king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years besieged it. Now, this is probably Sargon's predecessor here, but in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. According to the Assyrian records, that would be Sargon, who's mentioned only once in the Bible in Isaiah 20. But he carried away the Israelites to Assyria and placed them in all of these different places in the cities of the Medes. And the people that he took away were these 27,290 people, these are likely people who, if you wonder how did they build all of this stuff? How did they build this massive structure in the palace at Dar Sarukin? Well, the answer is slave labor. How were the pyramids built? How was the Ishtar Gate built? By slave labor, including, no doubt, Israelites who were forced to do all of this labor. They would carry away people who were skilled artisans or people who could tutor and teach language, or you could hire as a tutor for your children who were literate or who had some employable skill that you could then use as a slave, or maybe just slave labor to do that, because you don't want to leave these artisans or skilled people or informed or educated people, you don't want to leave them behind where they might foment a rebellion. You want to leave just common people that might not have the skill set to do that sort of thing. So a lot of these things are built with slave labor. So in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, carried Israel away captive into Assyria, and settled them in all these places, and resettled Samaria in an ethnic cleansing effort. Now, verse 7, this came about because you're going to get an explanation for these historical events and what happened. This came about because the sons of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they feared other gods. This is bondage to bondage. They start in Egypt, they come out, now they're back in bondage again. Then they walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the sons of Israel, and the customs of the kings of Israel, which they had introduced. The sons of Israel did things secretly, they thought anyway, which were not right against the Lord their God. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in idolatrous worship locations to the Baals and the Asherah, the female fertility gods. Moreover, they built these in towns, watchtower, fortified city, built for themselves sacred pillars of the Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree, all over the place. Verse 12, they served idols, concerning which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this thing. And yet, though the Lord warned Israel and Judah through his prophets and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, yet they did not do this. However, some did not. When they did not listen, he stiffened their neck like their fathers. They rejected his statutes and his covenant. Verse 15, you come down to verse 17. After they forsook all of the commandments of God, they made their sons and daughters pass through the fire. I said a while ago, I would like to think that maybe in the siege they're not actively killing their children. They're just taking, as often happens today in instances like that, where there's a plane crash in the Andes more than that, long time ago, and people died, and what do? You use them for food. Well, here, they are active. They're offering their children. Heating up an altar would be a common practice, and putting this infant as a sacrifice to a pagan god, Israelites. They made their sons and daughters to pass through the fire and practiced divination, did all of these things that God had said don't do, that they walked in the customs which Israel had introduced from all the nations round about them. And so the Lord rejected, verse 20, the descendants of Judah. Judah's doing the same thing. You would think they would learn from what happened to Israel, but as Jeremiah points out, and several of the prophets actually, you don't learn from your past sometimes anyway. So when he had torn Israel from the house of David, verse 21, this lineage of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king, and Jeroboam drove away all that and so forth. And we saw this text a little bit earlier. But he didn't do everything that he should have done. And so the king of Assyria, verse 24, brought men from Babylon and all these different places and settled them in the cities of Samaria in the place of the sons of Israel. And so they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. They had cleaned house. And this happened because Israel has departed from obedience to God. And you can read what happens later. You get down, and finally the last king to sit on David's throne is taken captive. The last thing he sees before they put out his eyes, before they blind him, is his sons being slaughtered. So his line comes to an end, but Jeconiah, that's a different part of the story. All of this happens biblically because the Israelites are not listening to what God is saying. But let me move on. We got a lot of other fish to fry here, but I wanted us to get this biblical explanation out in front of us. Now, Paul raised a question about the throne room and just the size of this, and I forgot that I put this in later in this, but here's a sense of the throne room at the top slide, 90 meters around on each side approximately, and then that's just a part of that area of the palace, which is just a part of the walled city, which you see, and here's a ziggurat, one of the things that are built to indicate an approach to heaven. The size of Khorsabad is interesting. I put up a map of Chicago. If you looked at the area that's commonly called the Loop, basically from the place where Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern supposedly and started the Great Chicago Fire in the 1870s, all the way up to where the fire went. That area of what most people would consider, what they know when they come to Chicago is the kind of tourist area and the Miracle Mile and Navy Pier and so forth, that would be about the size of Dar Sarukin, something like that. In fact, that's probably the size of every major city up to the early part of the 20th century or late 19th century. Most cities are small and compact like that. Then when you get a city like Chicago or New York where you can go down to bedrock and start building these skyscrapers, you get a steel industry. Now you start building up, and then you get suburbs and all of that kind of thing. But let me go back to this ancient history. This is the procession. This is a picture from one of our placards there of Sennacherib and all the other people in his retinue behind him, including a groom and stallions and people who are bearing tribute. You see this also on the black obelisk of Shalmaneser, but you get on the other wall Sennacherib and Sargon, and again, these figures are 10 feet tall. The Lamassu is taller than that. This is an actual picture, and maybe this will give you a sense of the size of the Lamassu compared to the wall of the people that is only a fragment of what we have going on there. Underneath the belly of this giant Lamassu bull-winged creature with the head of a man, you have all this cuneiform writing done with a stylus, usually on clay, where you turn the stylus perpendicular, either horizontal or vertical, and then it has a wide part of it and a narrow part of it, and you can make all sorts of chicken tracks there. This is a brag sheet that says how great is King Sargon who has done this. We're told in Joel to tell your children of it and let your children tell their children and their children to another generation, lest we forget the lessons that God is trying to teach them. When I'm taking children through, this is me and my grandchildren, I usually get down on the floor and sit down and say, look at this, and let's talk about what does this mean. But it's a fantastic kind of explanation for what we get here. I'm going to flip through some of these. We've talked a little bit about Sargon. Sennacherib, his son, 25 years later, again, we get an invasion of Israel. If you come over into the 18th chapter from where we were reading, you'll get about that. And the archaeological records report that an even larger number, 46 Judean cities, including 200,000 Israelites, are captured. Some of them killed, of course. Some of them would perish on the trip over. But Jerusalem is not conquered. 2 Kings 19 predicts that Sennacherib would be unable to take the city. He will not come close enough even to shoot an arrow into the city. And why is that? Well, you get the Sennacherib prism that's in the open Bible, and there's a picture of where the prism used to be. It's been moved a little bit. Yes, that's Betty in the background there. And the prism actually has a couple of different explanations. Herodotus, the Greek historian, comes along with this story of field mice. They had, for a while, the Old Testament record on the placard there. So you choose, do you believe field mice, or do you believe an angel of the Lord came and killed a lot of the Babylonian army? So Sennacherib who rebuilds or builds Nineveh, moves the capital there after his father is killed. And another part of the story, if you come over to 2 Kings 19, for example, and verse 9, and it's also in Isaiah chapter 37, you get this record of another king. In verse 8, Rabshakeh returned to the king of Assyria, and when he heard them say that Tirhakah, the king of Cush is the modern area known as Nubia, just south along the Nile River, but just south of Egypt. They heard concerning the king Tirhakah of Cush, saying, he has come out to fight against you. They sent messengers to Hezekiah, the king, saying, thus shall you say to Hezekiah, do not let your God in whom you trust deceive, saying, Jerusalem will not be given to the hand of Assyria. So they're trying to dissuade him from this. And then you get this account of Hezekiah's prayer, who took the letter from the hand of these messengers and spread it out and went before the Lord and said, you, God, are alone of all the kingdoms of the earth. This is verse 15. Incline your ear, O Lord, listen to the words of Sennacherib and the threats that he has made here. Truly, they have cast their gods into the fire, and so forth. And God answers him and says, because you have prayed about Sennacherib and I have heard you, this is the word of the Lord that God has spoken against him. Basically, don't worry about it. This is not going to happen. But notice verse 28, because of your raging against me and your arrogance, I will put my hook into your nose. I will take you captive and bridle your lips and turn you back by the way which you came. And so you come down in the text and you get in verse 30, the surviving remnant of the house of Judah will take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem will go forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion survivors, and the zeal of the Lord will perform this. Concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to this city or shoot an arrow there. He will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, by the same will he return, declares the Lord, for I will defend this city to save it for my sake and for my servant David's sake. And then you get verse 35 of chapter 19. It happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians, and when the men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. And Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh, the capital he had built after moving from Dar-Sarukin after his father died. And it came about that he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer his sons killed him with the sword and escaped to the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon his son, if you're British you say it one way, became king in his place. All of this happened because. And so you get Tirhakah, who you see on the timeline there, but this is a picture of the actual statue that came out from some of the excavations. The king heard, as we just read, it's also in Isaiah 37, Tirhakah or Taharko, depending on what language you're translating this from, was a Nubian general. He's from Cush to the south. As noted in the Bible, as the placarding notices here, became Pharaoh and was a great builder of the dynasty. And then after 25 years of ruling, he was defeated by Esarhaddon, about whom we just read in the biblical account. Now, some people point out that Taharko was too young at the time that these events, he was only 20, and was at that time, he was not Pharaoh, he was a general in his older brother's army. His older brother was Pharaoh, so his younger brother at about 20 becomes the general of one of these armies. And some people have tried to take this discrepancy and say, well, he wasn't Pharaoh then, so why is he called Pharaoh? And some even evangelical scholars have invented, well, maybe this is an account that wasn't written about in the Bible and we don't know anything about it, so we're going to say later when he was Pharaoh, he came and attacked. I don't see any reason to invent something that maybe doesn't exist. I think the simplest explanation for this is that he was not Pharaoh at the time, but because he later became Pharaoh, we accord to him the higher office. In the same way that if you're touring in England and you get on the bus and they take you by the places where Queen Elizabeth was born. Well, she was born there, but she wasn't Queen Elizabeth, she was Princess Elizabeth, I guess, when she was born. Well, when I bring bus tours into the university, we go past the place, the law school, where Barack Obama taught when he was, and I say President Obama taught there. Well, he wasn't president at the time, he was State Senator Obama. but we accord someone the higher office, the higher title that they achieve later in life. That's a kind of a common practice. I think that's the simplest explanation for it. But I need to move on. When the great Aswan Dam project was done, this is more about the excavations. These are the Abu Simbel excavations down. We're talking about Nubia now, so we've shifted gears to talk about Egypt and so forth. This is in the Pioneers to the Past book. But these fantastic wall creatures and everything else in this complex civilization is about to be destroyed. Abel Gamal Nasser, I'll get his name right in a minute, decided in this pan-Arab sort of thing in the 1950s, he was going to build the Aswan High Dam, which was a good thing probably. It controlled the flooding of the Nile. It brought electrical power to a lot of people, but it also flooded out this whole civilization. And so UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, put out an emergency call to archaeological institutes, including Chicago's, and said, come and dig. You get people digging in a sandstorm very quickly over a few seasons, which you normally wouldn't do. But as I explained to students who come in, we had a group from South Africa who came in one day, and they wanted to know, why do you have the right as Americans to come in and excavate all our stuff and bring them over here? And my answer is, and this is my answer, not the answer of the University of Chicago or the Institute itself, but these are the common lot of humanity. These are not not to be controlled by every tin-pot dictator who happens to have political control over a boundary of Nubia or Egypt or whatever. You may have heard the story about the Iraq Museum, and I'm blocking on who is, never mind. The dictator at the time opened the museum one day a week. You get this fantastic collection. It's open one day out of the year. Anybody want to guess what day? I'm still trying to think of his name. Who's the guy that the SEALs went in and, not the SEALs, but, yeah, Saddam Hussein, thank you. I'm getting old and forgetful. I can't walk and I can't think sometimes either. But you open this fantastic museum one day of the year, on your birthday, and you allow people to fire on the, anyway. So that's how some of these artifacts came to be. The striding lions, I'm going to move now to Babylon, so I'm kind of jet propelled going through some things here. These striding lions, which are two of them, are in the Chicago Museum, in the Institute. They're also in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, because the Germans and the Austrians with the Turks, controlled the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century when a lot of these excavations were done. So you get some in the Istanbul Museum as well in Turkey. But there are two of them in the Institute in Chicago, and they attract now they're up high because there were too many people's grandchildren came through. These are mine, but they didn't touch it because their grandfather said, do not touch the striding lions. But a lot of kids would do that, so they moved them up higher now. These are a part of the 120 that lined the great processional way to the Ishtar Gate in Babylon. Now, Babylon, of course, is constructed by Nebuchadnezzar the Great, a character that's mentioned in, 9 of 30 of the Old Testament books, nearly a quarter of the Old Testament books, in almost 100 passages. And in the Institute, we have the Nebuchadnezzar brick. It has a baked fragment of a brick that shows the cartouche, the imprint of Nebuchadnezzar the Great, who built this fantastic city that's now nothing but a ruin. We looked last night at the mud brick going back to Egypt. You get something like this. We also have, we had some of the mummies sent over to the University of Chicago Medical Center, the hospital, and they ran them through a CT scanner and said, sorry, they're dead. But if you're in the Egyptian gallery, you see that. And I talked last night about Seti I, one of the pharaohs, and his son Ramses the Great, who probably, or perhaps at least, was the pharaoh of the Exodus. It's an interesting point, by the way. I'll come up for air here for a moment. If you think about Exodus, which is how we know it, because of the translation, that's what it was called. But the Hebrews knew it as just, how does the book begin? Anybody remember? How would they know it? These are the names. These are the names of all the people who went down into captivity. So that's how people, before headings got put on some of these translations, whether the Septuagint or later translations, including English, these are the names. It's just like Psalm 23, or 22 rather, when Jesus says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me on the cross? And I used to think that what that meant was that he had this feeling of God forsaking him. And I still think that's true. I think there was a sense in which he wasn't actually forsaken, but if you're hanging on the cross in agony as the designer of the universe and your body is just unraveling and sending all these pain signals to your brain that you were the designer of, you might feel like you had been abandoned. But what he's really doing, I think, is saying, you people out there who were scoffing at me and putting up the King of the Jews placards and so forth, you think you got me, but think about Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it goes through all of the things that the dogs have surrounded me, and I count my ribs and so forth, and it sounds like the crucifixion, and it probably is a foreshadowing of it. But you get to the end of the psalm, and it is a psalm of triumph. God has heard me. God has performed. In fact, that's how it ends. God has done it. And all generations are going to know that. When Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's not just talking about maybe feeling forsaken. He's saying, you guys don't understand what's happening here. Because what's happening is that what seems to be defeat, what seems to be an inglorious end to the life of Jesus Christ, is actually God accomplishing His purpose for the salvation of mankind. And you get that because when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? What He's really saying is read Psalm 22 and read it all the way to the end to get the message of what's happening. So to go back to Exodus, if you think about these are the names, we get the names not only of the descendants that went down into Egypt, but you get down to verse 12 and you get two other names, Puah and Shiphrah, who are who? Anybody remember? Yeah, they're the forgotten midwives who delivered the Israelite babies, including Moses and Aaron and all the other. I mean, we would not have a book of Exodus. We would not have Moses and Aaron if it weren't for the midwives. I mean, probably other people would have. But you get the point. Whose name is not, I'm going back to Ramses, whose name is not in Exodus? The Pharaoh, the emperor, the ruler. He's just ignored. He's a nobody as far as the story is concerned. Now, I would give a lot to know the name of the Pharaoh. And there's a huge debate on which, was it Ramses? Was it somebody a couple of hundred years earlier? Was the date of the Exodus in the 1220s, the 1440s? We don't know. It would help a lot if we knew the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, but he's not named. I think there's a tremendous irony in that, so that while we have these inscriptions about some of the pharaohs, including Seti I and Ramses the Great, who's the guy whose mud brick has the cartouche on it that I had up a few minutes ago. And then you get into the Persian gallery. We have a foundation stone of Xerxes, Ahasuerus. We have, I'm just going to click through a lot of different things here that are on the list of what you have. One of the Nuzi tablets, Edward Chiera was one of the second director of the Institute after Breasted died, was the one who kind of was on point or had a lot to do with the discovery and publication of the Nuzi tablets, these cuneiform tablets. A book that I probably should have put on here was his book, They Wrote on Clay. It's an older book, going back to the 1940s probably, but worth a read if you want to know about cuneiform sorts of things. And then we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Did I mention pottery? You have this huge jar that was obviously broken, and then somebody put it back together, and there were jars like this when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls beginning in 1947. A couple of Arab boys, including Muhammad ad-Dib, Muhammad the Wolf, who goes out searching for his sheep, and he throws a rock into one of the caves down in the Judean desert, and he hears something breaking, and he comes back the next day with a friend, and they start to find these scrolls, which were put away by the Essene community at Qumran I'll say more about that tomorrow, but one of the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the only one that you'll find this side of the Atlantic Ocean, is in the Institute here. There's a whole gallery there about writing and how writing comes to be, including a practice board that a young scribe would use. It's coated with some kind of plaster that you could wipe it off. This particular one has the last person who was using it wrote in Coptic, in an Egyptian script, a passage from the book of Matthew. So this is after the 1st century. But if you were a scribe, you could make a good living, because you're using your skill to copy for people who are pretty wealthy, or maybe even the royal family itself, or the royal archives itself. And so if you could learn to write in a legible script and maybe learn the different languages and be able to move from one to the other, to move from Demotic to Greek to maybe even hieroglyphs, that would be an employable skill. Did I mention pottery? Here's a cook pot. Again, a broken pot that's been put back together, but these large pieces might be used to pull coal out of the fire, or water, or whatever. Well, I thought I was on that side because I'm looking at it here. Now you're looking at it. There are all sorts of figurines of everyday life. These are some of the royal scrolls. You would have a little cylinder seal. You would roll it across the wet clay, which is how you would inscribe with your stylus. And then once the clay you would put it to dry in the sun, or maybe put it in a fire or whatever to harden it. Or you might have, and there are all kinds of collections of these game boards and individual things. These are musicians with their harps and their lyres, or there's somebody in there that has a horn. These musical instruments were known in the Old Testament. God commanded the Israelites to use them. Sometimes people get the idea that I've heard brethren argue that God just never liked instrumental music. He was against it. No. The Old Testament makes it very clear God commanded this, including, you go back to Numbers 10, and he says, make 2 silver trumpets, and I'll tell you how to use them, including you blow them over your burnt offerings and your peace offerings and so forth. In other words, when you come to worship, I want you to play these instruments. And Hezekiah rediscovers this, or the priest does, and brings it to Hezekiah a little bit later, and they begin to use not only those instruments, but those that were built by David. It's true, David invented and designed some instruments of music. Why? Because God authorized that in the Old Testament. It was a common sort of thing that the Israelites knew about. Leisure activities, including game boards and so forth and so on. So we get all of this biblical background information, not just the big pieces that identify people and events like battles and so forth, but food and agriculture and cooking and coins and instruments and weapons and tools and housing and clothing and all these everyday things, in addition to the big museum quality pieces that are what originally attract people to the Institute. The Mesha Stela, which I thought I had a copy. Yeah, I do. Looks like that. Interesting story behind it. But Mesha, mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 3, the king of Moab was a sheep breeder who used to deliver to the king of Israel 100,000 lambs. You know, these sacrifices came, they would outsource it in this case. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. This stela, this standing stone, which has an interesting background, it also gives us a sense of how writing developed. But in 1868, when it was discovered, the Bedouin who controlled it decided, if the archaeologists are going to offer us X pesos for this or whatever currency they were using, we'll break it apart and get more money that way. So they heated it up in a fire and poured cold water over it and broke it apart. Fortunately, somebody had made a plaster cast impression of it, and they were able, finally, when the archaeologists said, no, don't do that, we'll pay you whatever we want, whatever you want, they were able to put it back together and reconstruct it. But again, it's another one of the more spectacular exhibits that you find there. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser, which goes back, it's actually the earliest account so far of an Israelite king. This is Shalmaneser III, so an earlier time. And you see in the second panel, the second from the top there, the Israelite king bowing down and bringing all of the kinds of things behind him, of grapes and animals and musical instruments and whatever were the best of their particular culture. Every panel shows different cultures. The second one is the Israelites. And so these Israelites are bearing tribute to Shalmaneser III. They are being put under the sword. They are being compelled to bring all their wealth, and ultimately they are destroyed. I mentioned the Rosetta Stone last night. This is the Demotic script from that, which produced the Chicago Demotic Dictionary, like the Assyrian Dictionary. There are all sorts of fantastic other things. We do not have this actually on display right now. It's being reconstructed and repaired, but the Etymonanke display about the ziggurat from Babylon is an impressive sort of thing. I mentioned the cylinder seals. This is an example. You take a little seal and you roll that across a strip of soft clay, and now you have left your imprint. If you are a king or maybe a wealthy family, for example. All sorts of Sumerian tablets. The King Tut exhibit is another one of these. So I've got 3 minutes. So what can we learn? I go back again to, we learn about direct Old Testament references, people, places, events, battles, conquests, what have you, that are mentioned in the Old Testament, and confirmed in a sense that now there's another source of evidence about that outside the Bible. But we also learn about ancient biblical customs that are referenced in the Bible and some obscure sites. So I put in my top 20 list here, which you have actually on the print. I think this is the last slide that I have in here. But I hope I've accumulated some sense of what's there, and if some of you want to come to Chicago, I hope that you will do that. I want to close with this slide. This is from J.J.M. Roberts, who is a member of the church, taught at Princeton for a long time, and he's talking about what's going on. He said, in Isaiah's day, the human crowd were still present for worship. It was God who had opted out. And you can read in Isaiah 37, 38, 39, corresponding to the text in 2 Kings we were looking at. The problem for religious leaders then was not how to get people to come back to attending worship. The problem is how to get God to attend. Perhaps we are spending far too much energy trying to figure out how to adapt worship so as to attract a disinterested public. I think all of us these days face that kind of problem. We're living in a culture that is just so secularized, it's largely not interested in God. Perhaps we might better please a potentially disinterested and increasingly irritated God by obeying His will and coming to worship Him. I appreciate very much the opportunity to be with you. It says 11:44. I was told to go 45 minutes, so I'll give you a minute back. Thank you very much. And is somebody appointed for closing prayer? All right, why don't we do that? Let's bow together and thank God for all He has given. Lord, from everlasting to everlasting, Thou art God. And we recognize Your power and Your sovereignty and Your majesty. And we acknowledge, as with Daniel of old, that we have disregarded and disobeyed and dissed You in every way, in many ways. And we pray, Lord, that You will forgive our shortcomings, that You will help us learn from Your word, that we be not like Your people in the Old Testament who would not listen, would not learn, and paid the consequences for that. Give us the strength and wisdom to live according to Your word. Give us safety as we go out now into the world. Bring us back together in our various assemblies tomorrow. And help us to be better, more diligent students of Your word, and not only learners and hearers, but doers as well. Forgive our sins and shortcomings. Save us at last. We ask in the name of Jesus.